There's one item in the museum which often leaves people scratching their heads before they understand it, and that can be found in our death section, and it's a horse skull. It's encased in a replica confessional, and it's just down here beside me. And the reason it's in the death section is there's a very interesting story behind it which connects to that. We're going to go back to 1993, and in Drangan, a small town in Tipperary, they were redeveloping and converting what was known locally as the old school building. And as they were digging it up, they discovered a horse skull. Not unusual, but what really struck them was the fact that it was only the skull. The rest of the body was not there, and there was no mandible, which is the lower jaw, just the top of the skull and some random teeth. They instantly contacted the museum, and somebody came out to look at it. And what was originally kind of a very dark, ominous kind of a discovery became actually established as quite the norm. And we're going to go back to Iron Age Ireland, which is when this phenomenon first began. So the deposit of a horse skull is actually what is classed as a ritualistic domestic deposit. When you put the word ritual into anything, it brings certain connotations to light. But what a ritual deposit is basically a mixing of domestic life and religious life in one. So we're talking about Iron Age peoples. So we're going back a couple of thousand years here, and we're dealing with a society that we don't really know their religion because it's prehistoric. So we're basically working off archaeologists and their kind of best guess, really. But what we think is that these horse skulls were placed in homes, other buildings, for what we think may be either religious purposes, maybe safety, maybe against, supernatural forces. But it wasn't just horses that were found. Oftentimes you'd have axe heads buried, you'd have pottery, and in some countries in Europe, you'd actually have human remains. Sometimes there was child's remains buried in walls and things like that. So it wasn't uncommon. But I suppose when you think of the time period this was actually discovered, which was 1990, the building itself wasn't actually built until 1806, which means that the horse head was placed in the foundation in 1806. And the original use for the building was a church. So that kind of brings a lot to play here, going, okay, we have a pagan ritual, we have a Catholic church, we have the 1800s, so how does that all mesh together? And the actual reality is that in the 1930s, the Folklore Commission of Ireland actually did a survey around Ireland, and they established that the burial of horse heads was actually pretty common. Most areas of the country had somebody saying that they were aware of this practice, and 99% of these people put the practice down to improving the acoustics of a church or a building, which is a far cry from what they would have done in Iron Age times. So it's interesting to see that this Iron Age ritual continued the whole way up as far as the 1800s. So in the 1800s, Irish people are still very superstitious. And that's very evident. For example, everybody at this point is very aware of Bridget Cleary. They know who she is. She was, for those that don't, she was a lady who was killed by her husband and burnt for being a witch in the late 1800s. And people think like, oh, rural people, fairies, they're just afraid of them. We're thinking with our modern mindset. But it wasn't just rural people. There's actually a case that happened about 6 or 7 years prior to Bridget Cleary in the late 1800s, and that was of a young boy in Clonmel town. He was born disabled. He was not able to walk. His mother worked outside of Clonmel town, so she dropped him off to her young sister, who was about 18 or 19, to look after him for the day. The sister and her friend had this idea that the boy had been swapped for a fairy or a changeling. They wanted to get their nephew back. So they put a shovel over the fire and, they heated the shovel up, and they laid the boy bare skin onto the shovel and burnt his back. Thankfully, he survived. He couldn't obviously run away because the child was disabled, so he couldn't alleviate the pain for himself. But they were actually sentenced to jail, and they were in Clonmel jail for a time, which was on the site of where we're standing currently. So this idea of, the whole idea of being afraid of fairies and everything, that's not a rural thing. That was in deposits all over Ireland, both urban and rural. It wasn't everybody, but that whole connotation was still there. So it's very interesting to see that we consider ourselves a predominantly Catholic country. And we obviously are aware that we had a prehistory with, rituals and things like that. But we have to remember that we didn't just click our fingers and become Catholic overnight. those pagan rituals infused into Catholicism. And even to this day, there's domestic rituals we still do, sort of, putting the rag outside the door for Bridget's Day. That is a domestic ritual. We're still doing that. So it's interesting to see that we have gripped on to certain traditions and we haven't let them go. The one question that people wonder as well is, why a horse? That seems to be the common theme, is it's always a horse in a domestic animal setting. Horses were very, very important, not just for travel, but for farming. They were seen as an elite symbol. If you look at Celtic mythology, the horse is very, very well known within that. So, for example, the Tomba Cúna is a very well-known story from the Ulster cycle of mythology. It's predominantly about a bull, but there is elements where they talk about two horses rising from a lake, and Cuchulainn trains them to be his personal horses for chariot warfare. Horses were very important. If you go to the cliffs of Moher, there's a story that the Tuatha Dé Danann jumped off the cliff and turned into horses as they fell into the sea and things like that. So the horse is very, very important in Irish culture. So why would they kill a horse to bury underneath their prehistoric homes? But you have to look at the society we're talking about. We're talking about the same society that's responsible for the bog bodies, which are very well known or are found in the National Museum in Dublin. These are people which were sacrificially killed, they believe, and placed into bog water. So they're preserved and they're fantastic to see. They know from looking at these bodies, they weren't, bottom of the barrel in society. These were people who were very, very prominent, potentially a king. Their hands show no wear, they're well fed. So, if they're going to kill their kings, I don't hold out much hope for the horse. So they would have been important. So they would have, seen this as, a sacrificial killing. Now, people often ask me then, was the horse here killed? The horse here is a mature horse. The teeth are quite mature. I wouldn't say that they killed the horse for this purpose. I'd say it was an opportunistic thing. There are some marks on the very backbone, the occipital bone on the back of the horse's neck. Now, they could well be marks from when it was excavated. So there's no kind of say that that's butchering or anything like that. But I wouldn't say that they killed the horse for that purpose, the horse. But either way, it's a very, very interesting story, and it really illustrates how far we've come in terms of religion in this country, but it also shows that both our religious paths are completely intertwined, and it's just a very, very interesting observation to make on our society.